Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's a baseline expectation of mechanical precision, right? Like you break your arm, the radiologist throws the x-ray up on the light board, and they just point to it.
Right, there's the jagged white line.
Exactly. They point to the jagged line in your radius, and the protocol is just immediately obvious. The physical damage is visible, it's measurable, and it's geographically isolated to your arm.
And honestly, it's a very comforting paradigm. The whole biomedical model thrives on that kind of, well, that binary certainty. A pathogen enters, a disease occurs, an antibiotic eliminates the pathogen. It's clean.
But for you, the listener, you probably already know that the second you cross the threshold into things like neurodevelopment, trauma, and especially mental health, that entire mechanical paradigm just completely shatters.
It falls apart. The X-ray machine is totally useless.
Completely useless. We are operating in diagnostic waters that are so murky that we basically categorize diseases purely by observing external behavior. We aren't measuring internal biology. And we're doing this in the middle of an absolute statistical nightmare.
A nightmare is the right word for it, yeah.
I mean, prior to the pandemic, and this is before the world even experienced that collective psychological stress test, Dr. Christopher Palmer, a Harvard psychiatrist, looked at the epidemiological data, and he pointed out that 1 billion people on the planet were suffering from a mental or substance use disorder in a single year.
Just to put that into perspective, that is 13% of the global population, functioning as the baseline.
Wow.
Yeah. And when you isolate Western demographics, the density of the crisis becomes even more alarming. I mean, in the United States, we are looking at a 50% lifetime prevalence.
Wait, 50%, so 1 in 2.
1 in 2 people. 1 in 2 people will meet the clinical criteria for a psychiatric disorder before they die.
That is just staggering. And then, of course, the pandemic hits, which acts as this massive accelerant. The CDC was doing these household pulse surveys during the peak of COVID-19, and they revealed that almost half of all Americans were actively reporting symptoms of depression, anxiety, PTSD, or substance abuse.
Right, which, I mean, you could argue some of that was situational.
Sure, yeah, but the data point that completely stops you in your tracks is the suicidality rate. At the peak of the pandemic, 10% of all surveyed Americans admitted they had seriously considered taking their own lives within the previous 30-day window.
10%. And when you filter that data for the 18 to 25 demographic, the young adults, that number spikes to 25%.
Oh my God, 1 in 4.
1 in 4 young adults contemplating suicide within a single month. And the scariest part is that we cannot just dismiss this as a transient lockdown-induced anomaly. As we progressed into 2023, depression rates hit the highest levels ever recorded.
So it didn't just bounce back?
Not at all. Over the last 15 years, anxiety disorders in youth have tripled. Autism spectrum disorder diagnoses have quadrupled in 2 decades. Bipolar disorder in adults has doubled. These are parabolic exponential curves, and they are occurring simultaneously across completely disparate diagnostic categories.
Okay, wait, hold on. Let's unpack this for a second. We really have to look at those exponential curves against the backdrop of our current medical infrastructure, right? Because we aren't living in the dark ages here.
Far from it.
Right. We have a massive multi-billion-dollar arsenal of interventions. We have SSRIs, SNRIs, atypical antipsychotics, mood stabilizers. We are out here utilizing transcranial magnetic stimulation, deep brain stimulation.
Ketamine infusions, psychedelic-assisted therapy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
CBT, DBT. I mean, the U.S. spends more on healthcare per capita than any nation on Earth. And we consume antidepressants at one of the highest rates globally.
Right.
So if we are deploying all of these sophisticated tools and spending billions of dollars, and the rates are still going parabolic.
And something is fundamentally broken.
Right. We are either deploying the wrong tools or we are aiming at the wrong target entirely. Are we just slapping Band-Aids on a gaping wound here?
That is exactly the paradox that Palmer forces the psychiatric community to confront in this deep dive. And the uncomfortable reality isn't that these tools don't work, because I want to be clear, they absolutely provide symptom relief for millions of people.
Sure, they keep people afloat.
Yes, but they are failing tens to hundreds of millions of others. When a patient cycles through 5 different SSRIs, maybe undergoes TMS, and still cannot get out of bed, they get slapped with the label treatment resistant.
Like it's the patient's fault.
Exactly. But Palmer suggests the failure isn't in the patient, it's in the model itself. Our current pharmaceutical interventions are almost entirely downstream.
What do you mean by downstream?
Well, they are designed to manipulate neurotransmitter levels in the synapse, like taking an SSRI to block the reuptake of serotonin. but they do absolutely nothing to address what is causing the cellular machinery to underproduce or mismanage that serotonin in the first place.
Ah, okay, so it's a triage model. It's like
Yeah.
we are bailing water out of a sinking boat with these highly advanced, incredibly expensive buckets, but we are absolutely refusing to look for the hole in the hull.
That is a perfect analogy, which necessitates a complete paradigm shift. If manipulating the brain's neurochemistry in a vacuum isn't halting the crisis, we have to look at what is happening to the rest of the biological system concurrently. We have to bridge that artificial divide we've constructed between the brain and the body.
And that overlap, that bridge, is exactly what Dr. Palmer and human biologist Gary Brecka zero in on. Because at the exact same moment our mental health charts are going vertical, we are seeing a mirrored parabolic explosion in metabolic dysfunction.
Absolutely. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance.
Right, and the clinical data linking these two crises, it just destroys the idea that they are coincidental. The bidirectional risk is staggering. I was reading that if a patient is diagnosed with a chronic psychiatric condition like schizophrenia, severe depression, bipolar disorder, their statistical risk of developing obesity and type 2 diabetes actually triples.
Triples. And the causality loops back on itself relentlessly. It goes both ways. If you have clinical obesity, your risk of developing a psychiatric illness increases by anywhere from 50 to 350%.
350%.
Yeah. And if you develop diabetes, whether it's an autoimmune type 1 or an insulin-resistant type 2, your vulnerability to almost every single DSM-5 psychiatric classification skyrockets.
That is wild. And honestly, the Alzheimer's data is probably the clearest illustration of this for me. Palmer highlights research showing that patients with type 2 diabetes have an almost 9-fold increase in the incidence of Alzheimer's disease. 9-fold.
Yeah, and neurologists are increasingly referring to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes now.
Right, because the brain develops profound insulin resistance, right?
Yeah.
It literally starves to death because it can't utilize glucose. And even when we look at the genetic precursors, like the ApoE4 gene,
Famous Alzheimer's gene, yeah.
exactly, the one everyone tests for. It doesn't just magically flip a switch that causes dementia.
Yeah.
The ApoE4 allele is fundamentally a lipid transporter. Its job is to regulate how cholesterol and fats are metabolized and moved around the brain. So the genetic risk is, at its core, a metabolic risk.
It's all metabolic. And Brecka's professional background provides this fascinating, almost ruthless validation of this connection.
Yeah, his background is so unique for this space.
It really is. Before moving into human biology optimization, his career was in mortality prediction for the life insurance industry.
Which sounds so grim.
It does, but it's pure data. His job was actuarial science applied to human biology. He was analyzing massive data sets, blood work from pools of 1,000 lives just to predict the exact timing of mortality so financial institutions could hedge their risks.
It was totally objective. The spreadsheets don't care about psychological theories. They only care about biological reality.
Precisely. And Brecka noticed this undeniable trend. When physicians intervene to correct a patient's metabolic biomarkers, driving down hemoglobin A1C, lowering C-reactive protein to reduce systemic inflammation, restoring insulin sensitivity, the physical health improvements were entirely predictable.
Like they lived longer.
They lived longer, they lost weight, their blood pressure dropped. But the unintended secondary effect was that these patients spontaneously reported their psychiatric symptoms evaporating.
Spontaneously. Like they weren't even trying to fix that.
They weren't even trying. Their ADHD suddenly became manageable. Their OCD loops quieted down. That pervasive mood numbness lifted. By repairing the metabolic machinery in the blood, they accidentally treated the neurology of the brain.
That is, it makes so much sense when you hear it. Palmer actually uses a brilliantly simple architectural metaphor to explain why this happens. He talks about the bicycle wheel. For the last century, medical specialties have basically been staring at the outer rim of the wheel, treating every individual spoke as an isolated disease state.
Yes, the silo effect in medicine.
Exactly. The endocrinologist looks at the diabetes spoke.
Oh.
The psychiatrist looks at the bipolar spoke. The cardiologist looks at the atherosclerosis spoke. But Palmer points out that every single one of those spokes connects to the exact same central hub.
And that hub is systemic metabolism.
Right. Systemic metabolism. We have treated the human body as a collection of isolated zip codes. We just assume what happens in the liver stays in the liver. But the gut, the microbiome, the pancreas, and the brain are engaged in this constant high-speed biological dialogue. 90% of our neurotransmitters are synthesized in the gut lining.
Roughly 90%, yes. including serotonin, which regulates our mood, our sleep, our digestion. It's not primarily made in the brain.
Wow.
And the vagus nerve acts as this massive bidirectional fiber optic cable. It's transmitting inflammatory and metabolic data directly from the enteric nervous system in the gut straight into the brainstem. So the concept of treating psychiatric distress strictly from the neck up, it just ignores the anatomical reality that the brain is constantly bathed in the metabolic byproducts of the entire body.
Okay, so if systemic metabolism is the hub of this wheel, I feel like we have to aggressively redefine what the word metabolism actually means for the listener. Because in the cultural lexicon, metabolism has just been reduced to a measure of vanity.
Oh, completely. It's a buzzword for weight loss.
Right. People think of it purely as the rate at which they burn calories on a treadmill to fit into a pair of jeans.
Whoa, I have a slow metabolism.
And that reductionist view is actively holding back medical science. Metabolism is not just burning calories. It is the foundational mechanism of biological life. It is the unfathomably complex orchestra of chemical reactions that take substrate, meaning food, nutrients, oxygen, and convert them into three vital outputs.
Okay, what are the three?
First, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. Second, cellular building blocks for tissue repair. And third, heat. Furthermore, metabolism is responsible for the immediate management and clearance of the toxic waste products generated by that very energy production, specifically reactive oxygen species.
So it's not just the engine, it's the exhaust system too. Exactly, it's the whole power plant. The biological threshold for life is so dependent on this process that many virologists actually argue viruses aren't even living entities because they lack innate metabolic machinery.
Wait, really? Viruses don't have metabolism?
They don't. A virus is basically just a string of code wrapped in protein. It has to hijack a host cell's metabolism to replicate. Without metabolism, there is no animation, there's no life. And if you zoom in on the cellular level to find the control center of this massive chemical orchestra, you land squarely on the mitochondria.
Mitochondria. Okay, I remember 8th grade biology, the powerhouse of the cell.
Right, but we need to update our understanding of mitochondria far past that cliche. These organelles make up roughly 10% of our total body weight.
10% of our body weight is just mitochondria.
Yes,
Yeah.
they are everywhere. And yes, they generate the ATP, but they are also the master environmental sensors of the cell. They regulate the epigenome, meaning they determine which genes are turned on or off based on the cellular environment. They manage apoptosis, which is the programmed cell death protocol.
So they decide if a cell lives or dies.
Literally. When a cell's mitochondria become damaged or dysfunctional or depleted, that cell loses its ability to repair its own DNA. It can't maintain its structural integrity, and it can't perform its specialized function. It goes into a state of metabolic gridlock.
Okay, so this is the exact mechanism where Palmer's brain energy theory bridges the gap that the current biopsychosocial model just leaves wide open.
Yes.
Because if I sit down with a psychiatrist today, they will tell me that a psychiatric disorder is a combination of biological factors, psychological trauma, and social environment. And obviously that's true. A history of childhood trauma, genetic predispositions, chronic social isolation, those are undeniable risk factors.
Nobody is denying the trauma.
Right, but Palmer argues that listing the risk factors doesn't explain the mechanism. It's like throwing flour, sugar, and eggs on a table and saying, this is a cake. You haven't explained the chemical reaction of baking.
The biopsychosocial model fundamentally fails to answer the how. How does a childhood trauma physically manifest as a visual hallucination 30 years later? How does that leap happen? Palmer's thesis provides the mechanism. All of those disparate risk factors, chronic cortisol elevation from trauma, neuroinflammation, poor diet, genetic variations in lipid transport, they all converge to cause mitochondrial dysfunction in the brain.
So the metabolic failure is the final common pathway. Everything leads there.
Everything leads to the mitochondria.
Now, I feel like we have to draw a hard, bright line here between normal human suffering and clinical psychiatric illness. Because we aren't saying all sadness is a broken cell. If you lose a child or you are subjected to violence, profound grief and terror are the biologically correct responses.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if a patient didn't experience profound distress in those scenarios, we would be evaluating them for severe sociopathy or structural brain damage.
Right. The system is functioning exactly as designed in those cases. It's like a car alarm. If someone takes a crowbar to your windshield, the alarm goes off. That is normal human suffering.
It's a signal.
But clinical mental illness, like a panic disorder, severe unipolar depression or schizophrenia, that is the car alarm going off in a locked, climate-controlled garage at 3 in the morning for absolutely no external reason.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it.
And Palmer's theory states that the alarm isn't going off because of a phantom psychological ghost. It is going off because the battery, the mitochondria within the neurons, is physically short-circuiting the system.
And when you apply this to the neuroanatomy, the localized symptoms make perfect sense. You have to remember, neurons are incredibly energy-hungry cells. The brain uses an outsized amount of our energy. If the neurons in the amygdala or the prefrontal cortex do not have enough healthy mitochondria to generate ATP, they cannot maintain their membrane potentials.
Which means they can't fire properly.
Right. They can't properly package and release neurotransmitters. They begin to wildly misfire.
Right.
So if this metabolic energy deficit occurs in the mood regulation centers of the brain, the patient experiences an unprompted, crushing, depressive episode.
The battery is dying in the mood center.
Exactly. But if the energy deficit hits the sensory processing cortices, the brain begins to misinterpret internal signals as external stimuli, and that results in auditory or visual hallucinations.
Wow.
The hardware is malfunctioning because the power grid is failing. It's that simple.
Okay, so if the root cause of these devastating psychiatric symptoms is a microscopic energy crisis, broken mitochondrial engines, the immediate clinical question for you, the listener, has to be how we actually fix them. Because if trauma or chronic stress has caused severe metabolic dysfunction in the brain, the intervention cannot just be some generic wellness platitude.
No, telling a patient in the throes of a schizophrenic break to practice mindfulness and eat some leafy greens borders on medical malpractice.
It's wildly insufficient. I mean, sure, for a patient experiencing mild cognitive fatigue or minor burnout, optimizing their circadian rhythm and removing highly processed inflammatory seed oils from their diet might be enough to restore baseline mitochondrial function.
Yes, for the worried well, lifestyle tweaks work.
But when dealing with severe chronic psychiatric disorders where the brain's metabolic machinery is fundamentally deranged, we require aggressive targeted medical interventions to forcefully alter the cellular metabolism. And this is where Palmer introduces a deeply established yet highly controversial tool: therapeutic ketosis.
And we really need to strip the cultural baggage away from the word keto immediately.
Please, yes, because the general public hears ketogenic diet and thinks of tech bro biohackers or internet influencers eating sticks of butter wrapped in bacon for rapid weight loss.
Exactly. And the American Heart Association has routinely dismissed it as a dangerous fad. But Palmer pulls back the historical curtain to reveal that the ketogenic diet isn't some modern internet trend. It is a rigorously tested medical intervention that was developed at the Mayo Clinic in the 1920s.
And was developed specifically to treat severe drug-resistant epilepsy, right?
That's right. Before the advent of modern anticonvulsant drugs like Dilantin, pediatric neurologists realized that inducing a state of physiological fasting could halt intractable seizures. But obviously, prolonged starvation isn't sustainable for a child.
You can't just starve them forever.
Right. So they developed a high-fat, ultra-low carbohydrate protocol that biochemically mimicked the metabolic state of fasting. By depriving the body of exogenous glucose, the liver is forced to oxidize fatty acids and produce ketone bodies, specifically acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate.
And those cross the blood-brain barrier.
They do. And they provide an alternative, highly efficient fuel source for those struggling neurons.
Now, here is where the historical data completely shatters the current psychiatric paradigm. Because the immediate skeptical reaction is, sure, ketones stop epileptic seizures, but epilepsy is a neurological seizure disorder. What does that have to do with bipolar disorder or major depressive disorder?
The connection is right there in the pharmacy.
Exactly. Palmer points out that modern psychiatry relies on epilepsy treatments every single day. If you look at the pharmaceutical mainstays for psychiatric stabilization, Depakote, Lamictal, gabapentin, Tegretol, these are literally anti-seizure medications. They were engineered for epilepsy.
Yes.
Yet psychiatrists prescribe them off-label to tens of millions of patients to stabilize mood disorders, halt manic episodes, and manage severe anxiety.
The irony is profound when you think about it. The psychiatric field readily accepts that chemically stabilizing the electrical gradients of the brain with epilepsy medication works for mental illness.
They write the script every day.
Every single day. Yet there is immense resistance to the idea that biologically stabilizing those exact same electrical gradients using an epilepsy diet could achieve the same result. The precedent has been hiding in plain sight for decades.
And the cellular mechanics of why beta-hydroxybutyrate is so effective as a neurological fuel are just fascinating. Brecka talks about this concept of light water, and I want to make sure I'm explaining the biochemistry correctly here.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so when mitochondria metabolize fuel to create ATP via the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, one of the intracellular byproducts of that chemical reaction is metabolic water. But when the mitochondria burn ketones instead of glucose, the metabolic water they produce is deuterium depleted.
Correct.
Now, deuterium is a heavy isotope of hydrogen. It has an extra neutron. And from what I understand, the nanomotors inside our mitochondria, specifically ATP synthase, spin at thousands of RPMs to generate energy. When heavy deuterium gets into that system, it physically damages the machinery, kind of like throwing a wrench into a high-speed turbine. But burning ketones produces light water, which lacks that heavy isotope, essentially stopping the engine from tearing itself apart. Am I tracking with the physics on that?
You have the exact mechanism down perfectly. Deuterium is twice the mass of normal hydrogen. The ATP synthase motors are intricately balanced proton-driven nanomachines. When they're forced to process heavier deuterium atoms from standard glucose metabolism, especially from highly processed foods, it causes immense oxidative stress and physical wear.
It's grinding the gears.
Literally. It leads to increased reactive oxygen species and mitochondrial degradation. Ketosis doesn't just provide an alternative fuel, it actively changes the intracellular environment. It reduces that oxidative friction and allows the mitochondria to repair and upregulate their efficiency.
So it's healing the engine while fueling it.
Exactly. It is a brilliant evolutionary survival mechanism designed to preserve neural tissue during periods of famine.
Okay, so the clinical application of this biochemistry is where the data moves from theoretical to just breathtaking. Palmer discusses a specific case study from 2016 that fundamentally altered the trajectory of his entire career.
Ah, yes. The schizoaffective patient.
Right. He was treating a patient who was morbidly obese and suffering from severe, chronically drug-resistant schizoaffective disorder. This patient was basically trapped in a waking nightmare. He was plagued by constant auditory hallucinations and intense paranoia, utterly convinced that wealthy families were tracking his every move.
And he had been subjected to the entire gamut of antipsychotic medications.
Every single one. And absolutely nothing touched the psychosis. The drugs did not work.
And the most incredible part of this intervention is that it was initially entirely cosmetic.
That's the craziest part.
It really is. The patient didn't adopt the ketogenic protocol to cure his schizophrenia. He had simply given up on his mental health. He just wanted to lose weight in the hopes of attracting a partner. So Palmer, functioning as his psychiatrist, agreed to help him implement a strict ketogenic diet strictly for metabolic weight loss.
And what happened? Within 2 weeks of entering ketosis, as the initial weight started coming off, Palmer noted a significant unexpected stabilization in the patient's mood, just a leveling out.
But the true paradigm shift happened a bit later, right around months 2 and 3.
Yes. The patient began spontaneously reporting that the auditory hallucinations were fading. The voices simply quieted down and then stopped entirely. The delusions of persecution evaporated. This individual ultimately lost 160 pounds, kept the weight off, moved out of his father's house, completed a professional certificate program, and, in what feels like an almost cinematic twist, began performing live improv comedy in front of audiences.
It gives me chills just thinking about it. He went from being completely paralyzed by paranoid delusions to stepping onto a stage to make strangers laugh.
It is a phenomenal clinical outcome, and it completely defies the standard psychiatric prognosis for drug-resistant schizophrenia, which is typically lifelong disability and severe cognitive decline.
Completely defies it.
Now, wait, let me push back here, because I have to play devil's advocate for the listener. As a skeptic, if you hear a story about a guy who changes his diet and suddenly his schizophrenia vanishes, the immediate scientific reflex is to look for a confounding variable.
Sure, you look for the hidden cause.
Right. What if this guy just had a severe undiagnosed B12 deficiency or a folate methylation issue, and the new diet accidentally provided the missing micronutrient? Like, we can't build an entirely new branch of psychiatry on a single miraculous anecdote from 2016.
And Palmer agrees completely with that rigorous skepticism. Individual nutritional deficiencies, B12, thiamine, severe vitamin D depletion, they can absolutely induce psychotic and depressive symptoms. And every competent psychiatrist should run a full functional panel to rule those out.
Okay, so he's not dismissing that.
Not at all. But we are no longer relying on a single anecdote from 2016. The dam has officially broken. We now have thousands of documented cases globally of patients achieving complete remission from bipolar disorder, chronic major depression, and schizophrenia using metabolic therapies.
Thousands of cases.
Thousands. We are moving well past retrospective case studies. We are in the era of randomized controlled trials. Right now, there are over a dozen highly structured clinical trials underway at apex institutions like Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, and Johns Hopkins.
The heavy hitters.
Yes. They are actively mapping the biomarker changes in real time to prove that repairing mitochondrial function definitively reverses severe psychiatric pathology.
Which brings us to a highly uncomfortable, yet totally unavoidable confrontation with the current standard of care. Because if repairing cellular metabolism is the key to resolving mental illness, we have to look critically at the medications that tens of millions of people are swallowing every single morning. We have to ask what those compounds are doing to the metabolic machinery.
We do. But before we unpack the pharmacology here, we must, and I mean we absolutely must, issue a definitive, non-negotiable medical disclaimer for anyone listening.
Yes, please.
Under no circumstances should anyone listening to this deep dive alter, taper, or stop their psychiatric medications independently.
Do not do it on your own. Never. Palmer, as a board-certified psychiatrist, is emphatic about this. Psychotropic medications actually alter the physical structure of your neuroreceptors over time. Tapering rapidly or without expert medical supervision can trigger massive rebound psychosis, severe autonomic withdrawal, and catastrophic suicidal depression. You must execute any changes under the guidance of a prescriber.
I'm really glad you highlighted that. With that safety protocol clearly stated, though, the data on the FDA package inserts for these standard psychiatric drugs is terrifying.
It really is.
And this isn't so...
Exactly. They assumed the drugs just made patients hungrier or more lethargic, so they exercised less.
But the basic science research is now proving that assumption completely false, right?
Right.
The metabolic derangement is not a secondary behavioral side effect. It is a primary physiological mechanism.
Yes. Researchers are finding that many of these standard psychiatric medications are direct mitochondrial toxins.
Direct toxins.
Yes. They physically disrupt the electron transport chain and impair the mitochondria's ability to utilize oxygen and glucose.
Let me make sure I fully grasped the gravity of this because it's horrifying. Palmer is suggesting that the root cause of mental illness is mitochondrial dysfunction.
Right.
Yet the primary first-line treatments we use to manage mental illness actively poison the mitochondria.
Yes.
So we are fundamentally exacerbating the root cause of the disease in order to suppress the short-term symptoms. We are permanently trapping patients in a cycle of cellular degradation.
It perfectly explains the phenomenon of treatment resistance. Think about it. A medication might successfully block a dopamine receptor, which suppresses a hallucination for a few months. But simultaneously, that drug is degrading the patient's underlying cellular energy grid.
The battery's draining faster.
Right. As the mitochondria become more damaged, the brain's overall health deteriorates, which means the patient then requires higher doses or additional medications to achieve that same suppressive effect. It leads to a cascade of escalating metabolic and psychiatric failure.
Wow. And Palmer introduces an analogy here that completely rewired how I view psychopharmacology. He compares the use of heavy psychiatric medications to the use of chemotherapy in oncology.
It is such a brilliant and sobering reframing of the clinical approach.
It really makes it click.
Yeah.
Because when an oncologist prescribes chemotherapy, they are fully aware they are injecting a highly toxic compound into the patient's vascular system. Chemotherapy destroys healthy cells, it ravages the immune system, it damages organs.
It's poison.
It's literal poison. But the oncologist makes a calculated decision. The cancer is going to kill the patient in 3 months, so we use the poison to eradicate the acute threat. We hope the poison kills the tumor before it kills the host. And Palmer argues that psychiatrists need to view heavy antipsychotics and mood stabilizers through that exact same lens.
Exactly. If a patient is brought into the ER in a state of florid mania or suffering from violent delusions or actively attempting to end their life, you use the medication as an acute life-saving intervention.
Right. You use the chemical hammer to stabilize the immediate crisis. Nobody is arguing against saving a life in the ER.
But the divergence in the standard of care is critical here. In oncology, once the tumor is in remission, the protocol dictates immediately tapering the patient off the chemotherapy to allow their immune system and cellular infrastructure to rebuild.
You don't leave them on chemo forever.
You do not leave a patient on chemotherapy for 40 years as a preventative measure. Yet, in psychiatry, the current protocol is often indefinite maintenance. Once the crisis is averted, patients are told they will need to take these mitochondrial toxins for the rest of their lives.
It's wild when you put it like that.
Palmer's theory demands that once the acute psychiatric emergency is stabilized, the clinical objective must immediately pivot. You have to safely taper the medication while aggressively implementing metabolic therapies to rebuild the patient's mitochondrial capacity.
It is a completely logical, scientifically grounded approach. But, I mean, implementing it feels like trying to reverse the rotation of the earth.
Oh, it's a massive uphill battle.
You are up against a deeply entrenched, multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical and medical industrial complex. The traditional model is built entirely on the profitability of chronic symptom management. You cannot patent a state of physiological ketosis. You cannot build a pharmaceutical conglomerate by prescribing a high-quality ribeye steak, an avocado, and a managed fasting window.
No, you can't. So how does a disruption of this magnitude actually gain traction in a system that is heavily incentivized to just ignore it?
The resistance will be immense, as it always is with paradigm-shifting medical models. But the disruption is already happening, and it's bypassing the traditional pharmaceutical gatekeepers through private philanthropy and open-source data.
Oh, right, the Bazooki family.
Yes, the Bazooki family is a prime example of this. They are a philanthropic family whose son suffered from catastrophic treatment-resistant bipolar disorder. They exhausted the entire psychiatric formulary to no avail. Eventually, utilizing metabolic therapies and therapeutic ketosis, their son achieved over 3 years of complete unmedicated remission.
Unmedicated.
Completely. And recognizing the massive gap in the medical system, they utilized their resources to launch Metabolic Mind. It's a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding the exact clinical trials pharma won't touch and building a global directory of clinicians trained in these protocols. And it isn't just grassroots biohackers pushing this either. The apex institutions are actually adopting it. McLean Hospital in Massachusetts, which, for the listener who might not know, is the psychiatric teaching hospital for Harvard Medical School, and is consistently ranked as the #1 psychiatric facility in the United States. They are officially launching a metabolic and mental health program directed by Dr. Palmer.
And that changes everything. When the premier psychiatric institution in the world begins treating mental illness with metabolic interventions, the rest of the medical community loses the ability to write it off as fringe alternative medicine.
Can't just ignore Harvard.
They can't. And the clinical protocol Palmer envisions for the future is highly collaborative. He acknowledges that the era of the solo psychiatrist managing complex pathology in a 15-minute medication check, that's over.
Yeah, 15 minutes is barely enough time to say hello.
Exactly. The brain energy model requires multidisciplinary clinical teams. You need a psychiatrist, highly skilled in the pharmacokinetics of safely tapering psychotropic drugs. But they must work in tandem with a clinical psychotherapist to manage the emotional turbulence of recovery.
Because stripping away the numbness probably brings a lot of emotions to the surface.
Tremendous amounts. You also need a registered dietitian specialized in therapeutic neurology and medical ketosis, an endocrinologist to monitor insulin and hormone sensitivities, and a health coach to ensure daily compliance.
It's a whole ecosystem of care designed to treat the organism as a whole, rather than just isolating the brain.
Yeah.
But we still have to answer the macroeconomic question, right? If pharmaceutical companies fight this because they can't monetize an avocado, what is the macro-level financial incentive that will actually force governments and healthcare systems to adopt this model?
The economic incentive lies in mitigating the catastrophic cost of disability. Under the current model, millions of citizens are rendered permanently disabled by chronic psychiatric conditions.
They are removed from the workforce entirely.
Yes. They become entirely reliant on state-funded housing, disability stipends, and continuous, highly expensive emergency medical and psychiatric care. The brain energy model offers the ability to take that massive, compounding societal debt and reverse it. By healing the metabolic root cause, we can take millions of impoverished, suffering individuals and return them to society as highly functional, self-sufficient, tax-paying citizens.
It transforms a spiraling economic liability into a massive societal asset. These patients reclaim their dignity, their autonomy, and their purpose, while the healthcare system saves trillions of dollars in chronic care costs. It is the ultimate systemic win.
It really is, and the utility of this deep dive relies entirely on application. Whether you, the listener, are currently struggling with pervasive brain fog and executive dysfunction, or managing clinical ADHD, or acting as a caretaker for a loved one trapped in the cycle of severe bipolar or schizoaffective disorder, this theory completely rewrites the narrative of despair.
It provides biological proof that the brain is not inherently defective. It's not permanently broken or genetically doomed.
The hardware is fine. The engine is just suffocating on the wrong fuel, and we finally have the instruction manual for how to clear the carbon buildup and reignite the mitochondria.
We have covered so much ground today. We've spent the last hour deconstructing a failing, siloed medical system. We explored the undeniable epidemiological overlap between the psychiatric and metabolic crises. We zoomed all the way into the cellular level to identify the mitochondria as the master regulators of both physical and mental health.
We traced the century-old history of the ketogenic diet.
Yes, utilizing that diet to stabilize neurological electrical gradients. And we confronted the incredibly difficult reality that many of our primary psychiatric tools are actively degrading the cellular machinery they are supposed to be protecting. It is a massive influx of data, but honestly, it is ultimately the most empowering medical framework we've ever encountered.
Because it puts the power back in the patient's hands.
Exactly. Because you, the listener, have direct, immediate agency over your metabolic state. You don't have to wait for a new pharmaceutical trial to be approved. You can demand functional biomarker testing from your physician. Go check your fasting insulin, analyze your inflammatory markers, assess your mitochondrial function. You can radically alter the fuel you put into your system today. Or, at the very least, you can take this paradigm and share it with someone who has been told their illness is a permanent life sentence.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up, I want you to consider this broader implication. We live in an era that is completely obsessed with external technological salvation.
Oh, for sure. We always want the new gadget.
We are constantly waiting for the next sophisticated neural implant or the next engineered molecule or the next synthetic interface to somehow solve our biological limitations. But if our modern, hyper-processed, metabolically toxic environment is literally suffocating the energy grid of our neurobiology, it demands a different perspective.
What do you mean?
Well, what if the key to unlocking humanity's next massive leap in cognitive evolution isn't a new piece of synthetic technology at all? What if it is simply rediscovering how to speak the ancient fundamental language of our own cellular engines?
Wow. I love that. Because if we can learn to clear the murky waters inside our own cells, the diagnosis you were handed doesn't have to be the end of the story.